In 1498, while exploring the Paria Peninsula in what is now northern Venezuela, Columbus came across locals wearing strings of pearls around their necks and shortly afterwards discovered a set of islands with astonishingly rich oyster beds. Explorers rushed to fill their ships with the prizes. Contemporary accounts record how sacks filled to bursting with pearls, some as large as hazelnuts, very clear and beautiful, were shipped back to Spain, generating fortunes for the captains and crews who brought them home. The sense of excitement was heightened by stories of the quantities of pearls waiting to be gathered, by their enormous sizes, and above all by the reports of the prices at which they were sold by the locals, which were swiftly exaggerated as rumors swirled around Europe. One ostensibly written by Amerigo Vespucci, put either heavily embroidered or more likely a forgery, told how the Italian explorer had been able to acquire 119 marks of pearls, around 60 pounds in weight, in exchange for nothing other than bells, mirrors, glass beads, and brass leaves. One of the natives traded all the pearls he had for one bell. Some pearls were so large that they became famous in their own right, such as La Peregrina, the pilgrim pearl, which remains one of the largest single pearls ever found, and the similarly named La Pellegrina, famed for its unparalleled quality. Both held pride in place in royal and imperial treasuries across Europe for centuries, depicted in portraits of sovereigns by Velázquez, and more recently as centerpieces of legendary modern collections, such as that of Elizabeth Taylor. The pearl bonanza was followed by the discovery of gold and silver as the Spanish investigations of Central and Southern America brought them into contact with sophisticated and complex societies, such as the Aztecs, and soon afterwards the Inca. Inevitably, and as you know, the Aztecs were also called the Mexica. Inevitably, exploration turned to conquest. Columbus had noted on this very first expedition that the Europeans enjoyed a major technological advantage over the people he had come into contact with. The Indians, as he wrongly called them because he thought he had discovered India, which he had not, do not have arms and are all naked and of no skill in arms, and so cowardly that 1,000 would not stand against 3. They had watched with wonder at one banquet as Columbus showed them the accuracy of a Turkish bow, and then demonstrated the power of a small Lombard cannon and of a springard, a heavy gun capable of piercing armor. The new arrivals might have admired the native characteristics of the people they encountered, but they were also proud of their instruments of death, which had evolved from centuries of near-incessant fighting against both Muslims and neighboring Christian kingdoms in Europe. Columbus had already advised on the passivity and naivete of those he encountered on his first crossing. They are fit to be ordered about and made to work, plant and do everything else that may be needed, and build towns and be taught our customs, he wrote. Far from the very outset, the local populations were identified as potential slaves. Violence quickly became standard. On the island of Cuba in 1513, villagers who arrived to present the Spanish with gifts of food, fish, and bread to the limit of their that they could, were massacred without the slightest provocation. In the words of one dismayed observer, this was just one atrocity among many. I saw cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see, wrote the Spanish friar Bartolome de las Casas of his experiences in the earliest days of European settlement in a horrified report designed to inform those back home of what was happening in the New World. What he saw was just the beginning, as he reported in his coruscating account of the treatment of the Indians in his Historia de las Indias. The native populations in the Caribbean and the Americas were devastated. Within a few short decades of Columbus's first voyage, the numbers of the indigenous Taino people fell from 500,000 to little more than 2,000. This was in part due to ferocious treatment at the hands of those who began to style themselves as conquistadors, or conquerors, such as Hernan Cortez, whose bloodthirsty expedition to explore and secure Central America resulted in the death of the Aztec or Mexica ruler Moctezuma and the collapse of the Aztec Empire. Cortez stopped at nothing to enrich himself. I and my companions, he told the Mexico or the Aztecs, suffer from a disease of the heart that can be cured only with gold. Rest assured, he purportedly promised Moctezuma, have no fear, we love you greatly. Today our hearts are at peace. Cortez exploited the situation perfectly. Although stories that his successes stemmed from the Aztecs, his belief that he was the manifestation of the god Quetzalcoatl were later inventions. So they didn't think that he was actually a god, but they made it seem as if they did. Striking an alliance with Xicotencatl, leader of the Tlaxcalan, who was keen to profit from the demise of the Aztecs, the Spanish set about dismantling a highly sophisticated state. As became standard in other locations in the Americas, the locals were treated with contempt. The native population, wrote one commentator in the mid-16th century, are such cowards and so fearful that the sight of our men alone strikes them down with fear, causing them to flee like women simply because of a small number of Spaniards. In judgment, wisdom, and virtue, he wrote, they are as inferior as children are to adults. Indeed, he went on, they were more like monkeys than men. That is to say, they could hardly be considered to be human. Through a combination of ruthlessness that stands comparison with the great Mongol invasions across Asia, Hernan Cortez and his men seized the Aztec treasuries, pillaging like little beasts, each man utterly possessed by greed. According to an account compiled in the 16th century from eyewitness testimonies, exquisite items were looted, including necklaces of heavy gems, anklets or of beautiful workmanship, wristbands, ankle rings with little golden bells, and the turquoise diadem that is the insignia of the ruler, reserved only for his use. Gold was stripped from shields and mountings and melted into bars. Emeralds and jade were looted. They took everything. That alone was not enough. In one of the great atrocities of the early modern period, the nobility and priesthood of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, were massacred during a religious festival. The small Spanish force went berserk, chopping off the hands of drummers before attacking the crowds with spears and swords. The blood ran like water, like slimy water. The stench of blood filled the air, as the Europeans went from door to door looking for new victims. It was not only the use of force and fortunate alliances that shattered the indigenous population, so too did the diseases that were brought from Europe. The inhabitants of Tenochtitlan fell in huge numbers to highly contagious outbreaks of smallpox, to which they had no resistance, and which appeared for the first time around 1520. Famine followed, with mortality rates among women particularly high. Agricultural production, for which they were largely responsible, collapsed. Matters were made worse because, as people fled to get away from the disease, there were fewer still to plant and harvest crops, so it was not long before the supply chain broke down completely. Fatalities from disease and famine were extremely catastrophic. As calamitous outbreak, perhaps of influenza, but more likely smallpox again, accounted for a large proportion of the Mayan population of Guatemala in the 1520s, where the stench of the rotting corpses hung heavily in the air as dogs and vultures devoured them. Then, a few years later, another pandemic struck, this time measles. The old populations of the New World did not stand a chance. The sea lanes to Europe now became thick with heavy-laden ships from the Americas. This was a new network to rival those across Asia in both distance and scale, and soon surpassed them in value. Scarcely imaginable quantities of silver, gold, precious stones, and treasures were carried across the Atlantic. Stories of the riches of the New World were heavily embroidered. One popular account in the early 16th century told of large nuggets of gold being washed from hillsides into rivers, where they were then gathered in nets by the locals. Unlike the tales told in Columbus's first reports that flattered to deceive, precious metals really were now flowing homewards. Many were stunned by the quality of the craftsmanship of Aztec or Mexica treasures he saw exhibited in 1520. Nothing I have seen in all my days rejoiced my heart so much as these things, one commentator wrote, of objects that included a sun entirely of gold and a silver moon, both of 6 feet in width. He was transfixed by the amazing artistic objects, marveling at the subtle ingenuity of the men in those distant lands who had created them. Boys like Pedro César de Leon, who grew up to be a conquistador of Peru, stood on the quayside in Seville, staring in astonishment as they watched ship after ship being unloaded and treasure being taken off by the cartload. Ambitious men raced across the Atlantic to take advantage of the opportunities that the New World presented. Armed with contracts and concessions from the Spanish crown, hardened figures like Diego de Ordaz, who accompanied Cortez in Mexico and later led expeditions to explore Central America and what is now Venezuela, made vast fortunes for themselves, milking the local population for tribute. This in turn created a surge in the royal coffers back in Spain as the crown took its cut. It was not long before systematic approaches to information gathering were being formulated at home, resulting in reliable maps being made, new finds being chartered, pilots being trained, and of course imports back home being cataloged and correctly taxed. It was as if a highly tuned engine had been switched on, pumping the riches from Central and South America directly to Europe. In addition, serendipity of timing, marriage ties, failed pregnancies, and broken betrothals had produced a single heir to the kingdoms of Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, as well as to territories sprawling across Burgundy and the Low Countries, and of course, Spain. With seemingly unlimited funds flowing back across the Atlantic, the Spanish King Charles V was not just master of a new empire in the Americas, but the dominant figure in European politics. Ambitions were recalibrated accordingly. In 1519, Charles V moved to strengthen his position further, using his extraordinary financial muscle to ensure his election as Holy Roman Emperor. Charles's good fortune was disruptive for other European leaders, however, who found themselves outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outjostled by a ruler determined to expand his power ever further. His wealth and influence stood in sharp contrast with those of figures like Henry VIII of England, whose income was positively embarrassing compared with that of the church in his own country, to say nothing that of his Spanish peer. Henry, a highly competitive man who, in the words of the Venetian envoy to London, had an extremely fine calf to his leg, combined with his hair short and straight in the French fashion, and had a round face so very beautiful that it would become a pretty woman, could not have chosen a worse moment to try to shuffle his domestic arrangements. At a time when Charles V had become the puppet master of much of Europe and the papacy, Henry's insistence that he wanted his marriage annulled so that he could take up with Anne Boleyn, a woman who, in the words of one contemporary, was not one of the handsomest women in the world, but was blessed with eyes that were black and beautiful, was reckless in the extreme, given that the wife he was abandoning was none other than Charles V's own aunt, Catherine of Aragon. In the upheaval that followed the Pope's refusal to sanction an annulment, the King of England was not just taking on the papacy, he was picking a fight with the richest man in the world, and a man who was the master of continents. Spain's growing importance in Europe and its rapid extension in Central and South America were little short of miraculous. A remarkable shift in wealth, power, and opportunity had resulted in Spain's transformation from a provincial backwater at the wrong end of the Mediterranean to a global power. For one Spanish chronicler, this was nothing less than the greatest event since the creation, other than the incarnation and the death of the one who created it. But for another, it was clearly God himself who had revealed the provinces of Peru, from which such a great treasure of gold and silver had been concealed. Future generations, opined Pedro Mexia, would not believe the quantities that had been found. The discovery of the Americas was soon followed by the import of slaves brought in the markets of Portugal. As these slaves were bought in the markets of Portugal, and as the Portuguese knew from their experiences in the Atlantic, island groups in West Africa, European settlement was expensive. It was not always economically rewarding and was easier said than done. Persuading families to leave their loved ones behind was hard enough, but high death rates and testing local conditions made this even more difficult. One solution had been to send orphans and convicts forcibly to places like Sao Tome, in conjunction with a system of benefits and incentives, such as the provision of a male or female slave for personal service, to create a population base on which a sustainable administrative system could be built. Within 3 decades of Columbus's crossing, the Spanish crown was already formally regulating the export and transport of slaves from Africa to the New World. As has been said before, they awarded licenses to Portuguese traders whose hearts and minds had been hardened by generations of human trafficking. Demand was almost insatiable in a region where violence and disease reduced life expectancy, just as had been the case when the Islamic world had boomed in the 8th century. A surge in concentration of wealth in one part of the world meant there was a sharp rise in the demand for slaves from another. Wealth and bondage went hand in hand. It did not take long, however, before African rulers began to protest. The King of Congo made a series of appeals to the King of Portugal, decrying the impact of slaving. He protested about young men and women, including those from noble families, being kidnapped in broad daylight to be sold to European traders who then branded them with hot irons. He should stop complaining, the Portuguese sovereign explained. Congo was a huge land that could afford to have some of its inhabitants shipped away. In any event, he went on, it benefited handsomely from trade, including that of slaves. Some Europeans, at least, were anguished by the plight of slaves and the seemingly relentless focus on extracting rewards from newly discovered lands. Although the prospect of recovering Jerusalem had slipped into the shadows, the idea of evangelization as a Christian duty quickly emerged in its place. Of course, the European settlers in South America, one senior Jesuit wrote angrily in 1559, failed to understand that the purpose of colonization was not so much to obtain gold or silver, or to people the land, or to build mills or bring wealth home, as it was to glorify the Catholic faith and to save souls. The point was to spread God's word rather than to make money. It was a clear echo of the protests of Christian missionaries traveling along the burgeoning trade routes and settlements on the steppes of southern Russia and Central Asia centuries earlier, who likewise complained that a fixation with trade distracted from matters of more higher importance. But in the case of the New World, there were good grounds for complaint about the disregard for the benefits of spiritual rewards. Gold was heading back to Spain in such volume that by the middle of the 16th century, some were describing the era as surpassing the legendary age of Solomon. So much treasure was being shipped, Charles V was told in 1551 that this period should be more rightly be known as an era dorada, a golden age. Not all the riches extracted from the Americas made it back to Spain. Almost as soon as fleets began to bring treasures home, sharp-eyed adventurers and pirates, based in ports in France and North Africa, could be found trying to cut them off and seize the spoils and treasures for themselves, either laying in wait on the final approach to the mainland, or as time went on, venturing into the Caribbean to intercept fat targets further afield. According of the accounts of the prizes on offer drew in opportunities from the far and wide. The reports of the great riches and glory that could be gained off the Atlantic seaboard of North Africa, wrote one contemporary despairingly, lured men there with the same excitement that spurred the Spanish onto the mines of the Indies. These included Muslim raiders who, as well as setting about capturing inbound ships laden with produce, also turned their attention to ravaging ports and towns on the coast of Spain, carting off thousands of prisoners in the process who were ransomed or even sold on as slaves. The raids were dressed up as being religiously motivated, although this was a heavily idealized way of seeing things. But even in the case of European piracy, there were political points to be made as well. Attacks on Iberian vessels became a regulated industry, with licenses known as lettres de marque being issued by Christian rivals to the King of Spain. The latter, in turn, promptly issued a heavily incentive pirate hunting contract known as contra corsarios to bring the worst culprits to justice. Those that were successful found rich rewards from the crown and also considerable fame, such as Pedro Menendez de Aviles, who notched up his prey in the manner of a wartime fighter pilot chalking up kills. A new world had been discovered overseas, but a new world was also being created at home, one where vibrant new ideas were encouraged, where new tastes were indulged, where intellectuals and scientists jostled and competed for patrons and funding. The rise in disposable incomes for those directly involved in the exploration of the continents and the wealth they brought back funded a cultural transfusion that transformed Europe. A swath of rich patrons emerged in a matter of decades, keen to spend money on luxury. There was an increasing desire for the rare and the exotic. Europe's new wealth gave it swagger and confidence, and also reinforced faith in a way that the recapture of Jerusalem had been expected to do. To many, it was entirely obvious that the seemingly limitless fortune yielded from the Americas was an affirmation of God's blessings and had been ordained by the Lord on high, who gives both and takes away kingdoms from whomever and in whatever way he wishes. The dawn of a new era, a veritable golden age, caused the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, which had prompted wailing, breast-beating, and tears in the streets of Rome to be forgotten. The task now was to reinvent the past. The demise of the old imperial capital of Constantinople, as has been said before, was taken by the Turks in 1453, presented an unmistakable opportunity for the legacy of ancient Greece and Rome to be claimed by new adoptive heirs, something that was done with gusto. In truth, France, Germany, Austria, Spain, Portugal, and England had nothing to do with Athens and the world of the ancient Greeks, and were largely peripheral in the history of Rome from its earliest days to its demise. This was glossed over as artists, writers, and architects went to work borrowing themes, ideas, and texts from antiquity of the Greco-Roman world to provide a narrative that chose selectively from the past to create a story which over time became not only increasingly plausible, but actual standard. So although scholars have long called this period the Renaissance, this was no rebirth. Rather, it was a naissance, a birth. For the first time in history, Europe lay at the heart of the world.